in my opinion, a society that aims for equality before liberty will end up with neither equality nor liberty. And a society that aims first for liberty will not end up with equality, but it will end up with a closer approach to equality than any other kind of system that has ever been developed. Now, that conclusion is based both on evidence from history, across history, and also, I believe, on reasoning which, if you try to follow through the implications of aiming first at equality, will become clear to you. You can only aim at equality by giving some people the right to take things from others. And what ultimately happens when you aim at equality is that A and B decide what C shall do for D. Except that they take a little bit of a commission off on the way.
And that sums up my view of equality quite nicely. Apart from equality under the law, I don't think equality is a particularly important societal goal. But you may have noticed there is an entire industry of loosely affiliated social justice causes that seems to think that equality is the ultimate goal. One of the ways of pushing the mantra of equality is to consistently harp on about inequality. And in a recent report from Oxfam, they did exactly that. An economy for the 99%. Now, are those Kenyan women appropriating Western clothing? I think they are. But here's the headline grabber. New estimates show that just 8 men own the same wealth as the poorest half of the world. Now, when I read a headline like that, I think, lift your game, ladies. Not even one in the top 8. But more importantly, what kind of numeric gymnastics did they perform to reach this conclusion? Well, let's hear from Bjorn Lomborg, since he was the first to point this out. Oxfam measures net wealth, not income. Crucially, it includes negative wealth, meaning the 5% of Americans with student loans or negative equity in their houses are considered among the world's poorest, poorer than 3/4 of all Africans. This means that even the most impoverished soul you could imagine, a day labourer from Zimbabwe with nothing but a comb to his name, in Oxfam's eyes is richer than the poorest 45% of the world's population. Oxfam's data also leaves out any entitlements to pensions and entirely ignores the huge assets owned by the state. So some kid that just racked up $100,000 worth of debt at an Ivy League college and is living in his nice middle-class family home with his parents because he hasn't found a job yet, or even if he has, he's still in a net debt position, is considered poorer than the Zimbabwean day labourer with just a comb to his name, according to Oxfam. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's see what The Economist had to say about it in an article a few days after Lomborg's. The world's least wealthy include over 420 million adults whose debts exceed their assets, leaving them with negative net worth. Most of this net debt is owed by people in high-income countries. There are, for example, over 21 million Americans with a combined wealth of minus 357 billion. Only people with relatively good prospects by global standards can be so poor. The wretched of the earth could never borrow so much. If all of the people with sub-zero wealth are excluded from the comparison, the poorest half of the remaining population would have a combined wealth equivalent to the richest 98 billionaires. And no doubt some people will still be outraged that the combined wealth of the 98 richest billionaires equals the poorest half of the world's population. But I'm not one of those people, and I'm not rich, but I don't resent those that are. So let's have a look at the rest of Oxfam's claims, which are a mixture of outright fabrications and social justice talking points. As growth benefits the richest, the rest of society, especially the poorest, suffers. The very design of our economies and the principles of our economics have taken us to this extreme, unsustainable and unjust point. Our economy must stop excessively rewarding those at the top and start working for all people. So this is your standard social justice critique of capitalism, that it only works for the few and not for the many, and in fact works to the detriment of the most disadvantaged, which would be a good point if it wasn't completely false. Now I'll grant one point to Oxfam, that inequality today is worse than it was, say, 200 years ago. But as Lomborg points out, that's because most people were equally poor. Nearly 200 years ago, around 94% of the planet was impoverished. In 2015, the World Bank found that for the first time ever, less than 10% of the globe was living in absolute poverty. Focusing on inequality alone means that we fail to recognize this amazing achievement, freeing so many from the shackles of poverty. And Lomborg goes on. From around the 1980s, something remarkable happened. Along with massive numbers escaping poverty, a burgeoning global middle class emerged. This class numbered around 1 billion people in 1985. 30 years later, it has more than doubled to 2.5 billion, with 430 million more Chinese joining. This is the reason that global inequality has actually declined over the past 3 decades, and quite rapidly so in the last 15 years. Moreover, inequality matters to much more than income. Half of all the welfare gains from 1960 to 2000 come from the fact that we live much longer, healthier lives. In 1900 we lived to be 30 on average. Today we live to 71. Over the past 50 years, the difference in life expectancy between the world's wealthiest and poorest countries has dropped from 28 to 19 years. Research shows that inequality in lifespan today is lower than it has been for 2 centuries. Education inequality has also declined globally. In 1870, when more than 3/4 of the world were illiterate, access to education was even more unequal than income. Today, more than 4 in 5 can read, and the illiterate are mostly older people, while younger generations have gained unprecedented access to education. Now, Lomborg does concede that inequality has risen within some countries. For example, in the US, the top 1% earned 19% of all income in 1913, but their share slipped to just 10.5% in 1976, and then doubled to 20% in 2014. And no doubt you've also heard about the shrinking middle class. Well, that is true. From 1971 to 2015, middle-class households in the US dropped from 61% of all households to 50%, a drop of 11 percentage points. But where did those people go? Well, 4% fell down into the lower classes, while 7% joined the upper classes. So almost 2/3 of those households that fell out of the middle class went into the upper classes. Not exactly a decimation of the middle class. At the end of the day, Oxfam is making the same mistake that all social justice advocates make. They look at outcomes instead of causes, and they assume because there are unequal outcomes that something nefarious is afoot. But they have it exactly backwards. The assumption that outcomes should be equal or would be equal if it were not for some corrupt system or bad actors is completely baseless, and all the evidence suggests the complete opposite. So I'll leave you with Thomas Sowell, a man who has made explaining this point a central part of his life's work.
One of the key implicit assumptions of our time is that many economic and social outcomes would tend to be either even or random. Everybody would finish up in the same place if left to the natural course of events, so that the strikingly uneven and non-random, rich people, rich countries, poor country, the strikingly uneven and non-random outcomes so often observed in the real world imply some adverse human intervention. Close quote. Why has that become an implicit assumption? So common that you need to bat it down again and again in this book.
Well, why is that something you have to ask the people who believe that? But if you're asking, does it have any validity? The easy answer is no. That if you start just with geographic things, geography is not even. the rivers of the world are not equally usable by human beings. I'll give you one example. The Zaire River, which starts in Central Africa and goes great distances to the ocean, it has more water than the Mississippi. But it's not as valuable as the Mississippi because it has all sorts of waterfalls, cascades, and so on. So there's only a certain distance you can go on the Zaire River. I mean, it's a more picturesque river, but to an economist, it's awful because it means that you've isolated great numbers of people. In a period of about 150 miles, there are, I forget, some huge number of cascades and waterfalls, adding up to a drop of about 1,000 feet. On the Mississippi, the riverbed goes down 4 inches per mile. Those are different rivers,
Right.
but everything is different. The ground is different, the air is different, everything.
Okay. Again, I'm quoting, continuing on this theme, the implicit assumption of evenness or randomness of outcomes in the absence of human interventions has been enough to turn a search for causation into a search for blame. Where do you find that?
Well, if all the background conditions are such as would lead to equality of outcomes,
Right.
and you find great inequalities, then somebody must have messed with it.
Right.
But as economic historian David Landy said, the world has never been a level playing field. It's not a level playing field geographically, culturally, politically, you name it, it's not.
And don't forget, if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, or consider throwing me $1 on Patreon. See you next time.